The phone rang at 2:17 in the morning and Callum Reese almost didn't answer it. He was half gone by then, slumped sideways on the narrow couch in the back office of Reese Auto Repair, still wearing the clothes he'd pulled on 14 hours earlier. His work shirt carried the particular smell of a long day motor oil and brake fluid, and the faint metallic bite of transmission fluid that had splashed across his forearm somewhere around noon. He'd meant to change before driving home. He'd meant to do a lot of things. The television mounted to the cinder block wall was running on mute, throwing blue shadows across the room, and the can of ginger ale he'd cracked at 10 o'clock sat on the floor beside him, warm and mostly untouched. 3 days of backed-up invoices sat on the desk. A cracked serpentine belt he'd been meaning to log into the system occupied the corner of the keyboard tray. The fluorescent light above the filing cabinet flickered every 40 seconds or so with the reliability of a dying pulse. He knew all of this without opening his eyes. He'd been sitting in that office for 6 years, and the room had worked itself into his nervous system the way familiar places do when a man spends more waking hours in them than anywhere else. He could navigate it blind. He'd done it once 3 winters ago when the power went out during a February ice storm, and he'd stayed late to finish a brake job that couldn't wait. The phone buzzed against the metal desk, and he reached for it without thinking the way any man reaches for a ringing phone when his child is sleeping 3 miles away. The number on the screen wasn't one he recognized. Area code 206. Seattle, same as him, but no name attached. Unknown caller. The kind of number a person ignores at a reasonable hour. The kind that at 2:17 in the morning means something has gone wrong somewhere in the world. He answered it. The voice that came through was a woman's. It was quiet in the particular way that quiet becomes when a person is fighting to control it, each syllable measured out like something precious being spent. There was breath underneath the words, shallow and careful. Please. A pause. I need you. Mercy General. Room 412. Please don't let me die alone tonight. Callum sat up straight. The ginger ale can tipped over and rolled across the concrete floor, and he didn't register the sound at all. His full attention had collapsed into a single point, the way it does when the body recognizes something before the mind catches up. Because he had heard those words before, not those exact words, but close enough that the variation didn't matter. 3 years ago, Joelle had sent him a text message at 9:52 on a Thursday night. He'd been finishing up a fuel injector replacement and had felt the phone buzz in his pocket and had left it there, telling himself he'd check it when he locked up. Just 10 more minutes, just until he finished the job. The text had read, I need you. Please come. I don't feel right. By the time he read it, 11:14, engine grease still on his hands, standing under the parking lot lights, she was already gone. Drunk driver on the East Side Bridge. The paramedics had told him later that she'd been conscious for a few minutes after impact, that she'd been alone when she died. He never told anyone that he'd had her message for 42 minutes before he read it. He carried that the way a man carries the things he can't put down and can't talk about. It lived in the space between his shoulder blades and came to him sometimes at 2 in the morning when the shop was quiet and there was nothing to do but think. He stood up from the couch before he'd made any conscious decision to move. His hand was already on his keys. He called Opal Gentry from the parking lot. Opal was 71 years old and lived in the apartment directly below his, and she had one of those constitutions that made sleep seem like a preference rather than a necessity. She picked up on the second ring, asked no questions beyond the essential one, and told him she'd be there in 4 minutes. Callum drove. The streets of Seattle at 2:30 in the morning have a quality that daytime erases entirely. Traffic signals cycling through their colors for no one. Storefronts dark behind their security gates. The particular emptiness of a city that is still there, still itself, but has temporarily stopped pretending. He made it to Mercy General in 18 minutes, parked in the visitor structure under fluorescent lights that made the concrete look jaundiced, and followed the signs to the elevator. Room 412 was at the end of a corridor that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air. The door was half open. He knocked once on the frame and pushed it wider. She was lying against white sheets, and the first thing he registered was her hair, copper red spread across the pillow with the kind of color that seems almost implausible against hospital white, like something that belongs in a different context entirely. She was pale in the way that illness manufactures not the paleness of fair skin, but the paleness of depletion of a body working very hard at something it shouldn't have to work hard at. An IV line ran from her left arm to a bag of clear fluid. The monitors beside her beeped with the indifferent regularity of machines doing their jobs. She opened her eyes when she heard him. They were green-sharp, despite everything, and they moved across him with the immediate alertness of someone who had not been fully asleep. "You're not the person I called." Her voice was steadier than it had been on the phone, still careful, still rationed. "No, ma'am." Callum stayed near the door, giving her the room's full width between them. "Wrong number. But I came anyway." She looked at him for a long moment without speaking. He was aware of how this appeared a man she didn't know standing in her hospital room in a work shirt that smelled of motor oil at 2:30 in the morning. He was aware of it and didn't move. "You drove here," she said, "for a wrong number. You sounded like you needed somebody." Whatever she was about to say next was interrupted by the door pushing further open behind him. A woman in a white coat entered with the particular efficiency of someone accustomed to delivering information that changes the shape of a person's life. Dr. Harmon was somewhere in her 50s. Gray-streaked hair pulled straight back, clipboard in hand, and she assessed Callum's presence in the room with a single glance before determining he was not a problem. The next 4 minutes were the kind that Callum had learned to listen to without letting his face respond. Dr. Harmon spoke about the results from the last round of testing. She spoke about the leukemia progressing more aggressively than the previous protocol had anticipated. She used the phrase critical window and the phrase treatment adjustment and the phrase next 48 hours in a tone that was professional and direct and left no room for misunderstanding about what those words meant. The woman in the bed, she had still not told him her name, listened with a stillness that Callum recognized as a different kind of cost. It was the stillness of someone who has been receiving bad news for long enough that they've learned to absorb it without visible damage. Her hands rested flat on the blanket. Her face did not change. Dr. Harmon turned to Callum, and her expression moved slightly toward something more human. She asked who he was. "Callum Reese." He didn't hesitate. "A friend of hers." Dr. Harmon studied him for a beat, accepted this, and told him what she needed to say. The oncology team would begin the new treatment protocol within the hour. The transition period was the highest risk window. Patients with people present tended to respond better physiologically, not metaphorically. Emotional state had measurable effect on certain biological markers. She said this with the tone of a scientist rather than a counselor, which made it more persuasive, not less. She left them alone. Callum moved to the visitor's chair and sat down. The woman looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully categorize. Not quite suspicion, not quite gratitude. Something that contained both without committing to either. Vivian Ashworth. She said it the way people say their names when they're testing whether you'll react to it. He didn't. The name was familiar in the vague way that prominent names are familiar when you exist adjacent to the world where they circulate. He'd seen it on a headline or two. Business News Acquisitions, something about Ashworth Media Group. He didn't follow the business pages closely. His world ran on labor hours and parts costs and whether the alignment machine needed recalibration. "Callum Reese," he said again. "I own an auto repair shop about 4 miles from here." Something in Vivian's face shifted. Not relief exactly, but the particular relaxation of a person who has been bracing for a threat that didn't materialize. "The person I was trying to call was my ex-boyfriend." She glanced toward the window where the city lights blurred against condensation on the glass. "We ended things 3 weeks ago, when I got the diagnosis." She paused. "I called him anyway. Apparently I transposed 2 digits. "His loss," Callum said. She looked back at him. Something crossed her face that might have been the early architecture of a smile, though it didn't fully arrive. They talked for the next 2 hours while the nursing staff moved in and out, efficient and unhurried, beginning the new protocol. Callum talked about Nadia, the way he always talked about Nadia, which was the way a man talks about the thing that keeps him oriented when everything else is uncertain. He told Vivian about the robotics kit Nadia had dismantled and reassembled into something entirely different, about the gap-toothed smile that had been Joel's smile first, about the way the child sometimes said things that stopped him cold because the observation was too precise for 6 years of living. In return, Vivian talked in fragments. Her father, William Ashworth, had died 14 months ago and left her controlling interest in the company he'd built over 40 years. A man named Franklin Doyle, who had been William's right hand and had expected to inherit the company's future, had not forgiven the bequest. The board of directors Doyle had spent 3 decades cultivating was now using her illness as leverage, documenting every moment of visible weakness, building a case that she was unfit to lead. She said all of this with the flatness of someone reporting facts rather than grievances, but her hands flat on that blanket pressed down harder when she got to Doyle's name. Around 4:30 she fell asleep mid-sentence, not gradually but all at once, the way bodies surrender when they've been holding on for too long. Callum sat with her until the morning nursing shift came through at 6. He drove home in the pale gray of early Seattle dawn, picked Nadia up from Opal's apartment, made her breakfast, and dropped her at school. He did not mention where he'd been. He spent the next 3 days thinking about the wrong number, the way a man thinks about something he doesn't intend to act on but keeps returning to anyway. He was under a 19 F250 on the second afternoon when he heard his shop phone ring and then his cell phone immediately after. He rolled out from under the truck to find a text from an unsaved number. "This is Vivian. I made it through. Thank you for staying." He typed back, "Glad to hear it. Take care of yourself." He rolled back under the truck. He thought he was done. He was not done. Monday morning came in gray and damp, the way Seattle Mondays have a habit of doing, and Callum was in the shop bay running a diagnostic on a Subaru with a persistent misfire when he heard tires on the lot that didn't belong to any of his regulars. He knew his regulars by sound, the way they pulled in the particular gravel spray of familiar vehicles finding their usual spots. This was different, slower, more deliberate. He pushed out from under the hood and saw the Mercedes in the lot. Black Current model, the kind of car that costs more per month than Callum's entire equipment loan. The driver stepped out first, a man in a suit that had no business being within 20 feet of an auto shop, and opened the rear door. Vivian Ashworth stepped out. She looked different from the hospital. Better, obviously. The hospital pallor was still there, but less severe, less immediate. She was wearing dark slacks and a camel-colored coat and a silk scarf wrapped with a certain precision around her head that told him the hair loss was further along than it had appeared against the pillow. She looked at the shop with the expression of someone genuinely seeing an auto repair bay for the first time, taking in the hydraulic lifts and the parts shelves and the snap-on toolbox Callum had spent 4 years paying off, and then she looked at him. He wiped his hands on the shop rag hanging from his back pocket and waited. "I'd like to offer you a proposition," Vivian said. She wasn't someone who spent words on preamble. He was already noticing this about her. "One that might sound strange at first. I hope you'll hear it through before deciding." He heard it through. She explained it the way she'd apparently explained many things, with precision and without apology, laying out the architecture first and then the details, the way an engineer presents a solution rather than a salesperson presents a pitch. Franklin Doyle was moving to force a vote of no confidence at the next board meeting. He had documentation of every treatment day, every public appearance where her illness had shown, every meeting where medication fog had made her seem uncertain. He was going to use her diagnosis against her, and he was good at it because he had 30 years of knowing which levers moved which people. What she needed was visible proof that she was not alone, that she was not failing, that the woman who ran Ashworth Media Group was not an isolated, deteriorating figure that a board of directors could pity away from her own company. What she needed specifically was someone standing beside her who had nothing to gain from her industry, no existing loyalties that could be questioned, no history that could be weaponized. Someone who had already demonstrated through a wrong number in the middle of the night that they showed up. "I'll pay you $1.5 million, Vivian said. 6 months. Accompany me to treatments, to board appearances, to whatever public functions are necessary. Be seen with me. Let the world believe we're together. She paused. "It's enough to secure your daughter's future entirely. College, whatever she needs." The number landed in Callum's chest and stayed there. He laughed. He didn't mean to. It came out of him the way involuntary things do, not from humor, but from the sheer strangeness of standing in his shop in a grease-stained shirt being offered $1.5 million by a woman he'd met through a wrong number 4 days ago. He laughed for about 4 seconds. Then he looked at the corkboard above the parts counter where he'd pinned a photograph of Nadia on her first day of kindergarten, gap-toothed and triumphant in her backpack. Beside it, Joelle, smiling the same smile. He stopped laughing. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. He told Vivian he needed to think. She gave him the number of her assistant and told him she'd need his answer by Tuesday morning because the timeline was not flexible. Her driver held the door. The Mercedes reversed out of the lot with the unhurried confidence of a vehicle that had never had to parallel park. Callum stood in the bay for a moment with the shop rag in his hands, then went back to the Subaru. He thought about it for the rest of the day, and through the process of making dinner, and through the bath time ritual, and through reading Nadia her chapter of the current book, which was about a girl who built her own rocket ship from salvaged parts. He thought about it the way he thought about large decisions, not in a straight line, but in circles that kept passing through the same territory. He thought about Nadia's cardiology follow-up in November, the one where Dr. Pulaski would tell him whether the small defect in her mitral valve had stabilized or was trending in the direction that meant more serious intervention. He thought about what serious intervention cost. He thought about the academic program at Westbrook that Nadia's teacher had quietly recommended, the one for kids who showed the particular kind of spatial reasoning that teachers recognized and parents couldn't always afford to cultivate. He thought about the back bedroom water leak he'd been patching with caulk for 8 months because a proper repair was $3,000 he hadn't been able to align with everything else. He thought about Joelle, who had believed without reservation that a man's worth was not his balance sheet, and had meant it had lived it every day of their 12 years together, and had somehow also been the most pragmatic person he'd ever known. He thought about what she would say. He didn't have any trouble hearing her voice when he tried. That was one of the mercies. He could still hear her clearly. She would have said, "Don't be noble," when noble means Nadia pays for it. He had been sitting at the kitchen table long enough that his coffee had gone cold when Nadia patted out in her socks, the ones with the little wrenches on them that she had requested specifically and with great seriousness from her last birthday. She climbed into the chair across from him without being invited and regarded him with the focused attention she applied to things she found genuinely interesting. "You have your thinking face," she informed him. "I have a lot of things on my mind. Is it about the lady from the hospital?" He looked at her. He hadn't mentioned the hospital at all. "Opal told me," Nadia said with the matter-of-fact delivery of someone reporting weather. "She said you went to help somebody who was scared. She said that's what you do." A brief pause. "Is the lady okay?" "She's going to have a hard few months," Callum said. "She's sick. She needs help." Nadia considered this with the seriousness she applied to mechanical problems and story logic. "What kind of help?" he told her. "Not the full version, not the money, not the contract, but the shape of it. That the lady was fighting for something important, and that she was fighting alone, and that he had been asked to stand beside her for a while. That because of how much time it would take, people might get the wrong idea about what they were to each other." Nadia was quiet for a moment that felt longer than 6-year-old silences usually lasted. Then, "Is she the lady with no smile from my drawing this morning?" Callum's throat tightened. He'd seen the drawing on the back seat, a tall woman with copper-colored hair and a face that had eyes and a nose, but whose mouth was a straight, flat line. He had not said anything about it because he'd assumed it was the kind of abstract image children produce without particular intent. "What made you draw her?" he asked. Nadia shrugged in the way she shrugged when the answer seemed obvious. "I dreamed about her. She was standing by herself and everybody kept walking past." A pause. "I think you should help her, Daddy. Mommy would say yes." The certainty in her voice was the kind that doesn't argue with itself. Callum sat with it for a moment. Outside, a car moved slowly past the building, its headlights sweeping briefly across the ceiling. He reached over and put his hand over hers, the small hand with the bitten thumbnail and the permanent faint ink stain on the index finger from the marker she claimed she hadn't used on the dining room table. "Nadia." His voice came out rougher than he intended, and he let it. "If I do this, you and I still have our rules. We tell each other the truth. All of it, always. You'll know what this is and what it isn't." She nodded with the gravity of someone entering a formal agreement. "I know, Daddy. It's going to change some things for a while. My schedule, where we might live, some of that. Can I still do robotics club?" "Yes." "Okay." She slid off the chair with the efficiency of someone whose business was concluded. Halfway back to her room, she stopped and turned around. "She needs to learn to smile, though. You should teach her. You have the best smile." She disappeared down the hallway. Callum sat at the table for another 20 minutes. Then he picked up his phone. Vivian answered on the second ring. It was past 9:30. He'd expected voicemail. "I'll do it," he said. "But I need 2 things understood before we go any further. First, Nadia comes before everything. Every single time without discussion. If her health, her school, her well-being, any of it comes into conflict with whatever this arrangement requires, the arrangement yields. Not the other way around. That's not negotiable." A beat of silence. "Agreed." "Second, I won't lie to her about what this is. She knows the shape of it. She'll know it's not real. You and I can be whatever the world needs us to be, but my daughter knows the truth." Another brief silence, this one with a different quality. "That's more integrity than I expected." "That's not a compliment I'm looking for," Callum said. "It's just how I operate." He heard something through the phone, then not words, but the kind of exhale that comes when a person has been holding tension in a specific place for a long time, and something has finally allowed them to release just a fraction of it. "When can you start?" Vivian asked. "Her first chemo appointment is Monday," he said. He didn't ask how he knew. He'd remembered it from the hospital. "I'll be there. I'll have someone bring appropriate clothing on Friday. I have clothing. Appropriate for a board presentation at Ashworth Tower." He thought about the suits he owned. The navy one he'd worn to Joelle's funeral that had been pressed exactly once since. The gray jacket that had developed a persistent pull at the left shoulder seam. "Friday is fine," he said. After he hung up, he sat for another moment in the kitchen, quiet, listening to the building settle and the distant sound of Nadia's tablet playing the soft instrumental music she needed to fall asleep. He thought about what he'd just agreed to. He thought about Joelle's voice, which he could still hear clearly saying, "Don't be noble," when noble means Nadia pays for it. Then he thought about Vivian Ashworth lying still against white sheets, with her hands flat on the blanket and her eyes too sharp for the body they were in, and the way she'd looked at him when he'd told her he came anyway. Like she was trying to determine whether that was something that actually happened in the world. He washed his coffee cup and went to check on Nadia, who was asleep on her side with one arm hanging over the edge of the mattress and the other clutching the small plush gear she'd named Gerald after no one in particular. He tucked the hanging arm back under the blanket. He stood there for a moment in the dark, listening to her breathe. On the nightstand, barely visible in the light from the hallway, was the drawing. The woman with copper hair and the flat, smileless mouth, standing alone while everyone walked past. Callum turned off the hallway light and went to bed. On Friday morning, a courier arrived at the shop with a garment bag and a handwritten note from someone named Sloane Baxter, identified as Vivian Ashworth's assistant. The note was precise and brief. The clothes inside were appropriate for a range of settings. A tailor would be available Monday morning if adjustments were needed, and there was a folder in the outer pocket with background on the people Callum would likely encounter at Ashworth Media in the first weeks. He unzipped the bag. Inside was a charcoal suit with a weight and drape that was clearly not off a rack. Beside it folded a shirt the color of slate. A tie he would never have selected for himself, that he immediately recognized was exactly right, and a pair of shoes that fit when he tried them that evening, as if someone had taken measurements he'd never given. He put the suit back in the bag and hung it on the back of the office door. He finished his shift. He picked up Nadia from school and listened to her explain at length the engineering flaw in her classroom's pencil holder design and why her proposed revision would reduce spill incidents by approximately 60%. He made dinner. He read the folder from Sloane Baxter after Nadia was asleep. Franklin Doyle, 64 years old, 31 years at Ashworth Media. The kind of man who had outlasted 4 CEOs before William Ashworth and had considered himself irreplaceable, which was different from being invaluable. He had alliances on the board that predated Vivian's involvement in the company by 2 decades. He had cultivated a reputation for fiscal conservatism and institutional memory that made younger directors defer to him on instinct. He had, according to what Callum was reading between the carefully neutral lines of a company briefing, been building a case against Vivian since the day the will was read. Callum closed the folder and sat with it for a moment. He was not a man who intimidated easily. He'd grown up in a house where his father, a retired Army Staff Sergeant named James Reese, had taught him that dignity was not a reward for good behavior, but a baseline that no external condition could remove unless you allowed it to. He'd carried that through 20 years of being a black man running a small business in a city where small businesses failed at rates that had nothing to do with the quality of their work. He knew what it was to walk into rooms where someone had already decided what his presence meant, and he knew how to remain himself in those rooms. But he was clear-eyed about what Monday would be. He put the folder in his bag. He looked at the garment bag on the door. He looked at the photograph of Nadia on the corkboard, and beside it, Joelle. "I have no idea what I'm doing," he said to the photograph, not asking for permission, just stating a fact. Joelle had always appreciated honesty more than confidence. On Sunday night he ironed the shirt himself because ironing was one of those tasks his father had taught him to do well, and he'd never outsourced it. He polished the shoes. He set his alarm for 5:30. When it went off Monday morning, Nadia was already sitting on the foot of his bed, fully dressed, watching him with the quiet intensity she reserved for important occasions. "You look different," she said, watching him button the shirt. "Different how?" She tilted her head. "Like yourself, but louder." He looked at himself in the mirror. The suit fit in a way his own clothes did not. Not because it was expensive, but because someone had understood that clothes for a man this size, this build, needed to acknowledge the breadth of his shoulders without fighting them. He looked, he thought, like a version of himself that had always been possible. "Daddy." Nadia slid off the bed and came to stand beside him, looking at their reflection together in the mirror. She barely reached his elbow. "Don't forget who you are while you're there. Okay." His chest compressed around something he didn't have a name for. He crouched down so they were eye level. "Not possible," he said. She handed him her phone. He looked at the screen. She had typed a text message addressed to him that read, "Don't forget who you are, Dad." He laughed, real laughter this time, full and unguarded, and pulled her into a hug that she tolerated for exactly as long as she chose to before squirming away with her dignity intact. He drove her to school. He watched her run through the front doors without looking back, which was how she always did it, which was exactly right. Then he turned the truck toward Ashworth Tower. The first chemotherapy session was on a Monday, 3 weeks after Callum had driven through empty Seattle streets toward a wrong number, and he arrived at the Ashworth Medical Center's private oncology suite 40 minutes early because he did not know what else to do with the anxiety except show up ahead of it. The suite was nothing like the clinical fluorescence of Mercy General. Someone with money and intention had made decisions about this space. Low lighting chairs upholstered in warm gray fabric, a side table with actual flowers rather than the plastic approximations that populated hospital waiting rooms. The equipment was identical to any other oncology floor, the IV stands and the monitors and the pharmaceutical refrigerators behind the nursing station, but the room had been arranged to suggest that the people receiving treatment here were still people rather than patients. Callum noted this and found it both considerate and faintly absurd, the way expensive amenities always are when placed adjacent to something that cannot be softened by design. Vivian arrived at 8:15 in a car he recognized as the same Mercedes from the shop lot. She was dressed simply: dark trousers, a cream blouse, the silk scarf replaced by something more structured, a wrapped style that was clearly deliberate and clearly practiced. She moved through the suite with the composure of a woman who had been through this particular door enough times that it no longer surprised her, speaking briefly to the nurse who came forward, confirming something on a tablet, initialing a form. She did all of this before she fully acknowledged Callum's presence, and when she finally turned to him, her expression carried the slight guardedness of someone who had expected him to be in the waiting area and not in the treatment room itself. "You can wait outside," she said, not unkind, matter of fact the way she said most things. Callum settled into the chair beside the recliner where the nurse was preparing her arm. "I'm good here." Vivian looked at him for a moment with the calculation of someone deciding whether to expend energy on an argument. She decided against it. She sat in the recliner and extended her arm and looked at the wall while the nurse established the line, and Callum watched her face do the thing it did when she was absorbing something. She refused to show a slight compression around the eyes, a controlled exhale through the nose. Nothing that would read as pain to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. He was paying close attention. Over the next 3 hours, as the chemicals moved through the line and the monitors registered their steady, indifferent data, they talked. Not about the arrangement, not about the board or Doyle or the architecture of what they were building together in public. Those conversations had happened over the phone during the previous weeks, efficiently and without sentimentality. They talked about other things. Vivian asked him questions about the shop with the focused curiosity of someone who had grown up in a world where things were replaced rather than repaired, and Callum answered them the way he always answered questions about work he loved, which was directly and with more detail than the question probably required. She asked what it felt like to know exactly how something was broken and exactly what it needed. He thought about it for a moment before answering, which she seemed to appreciate. She had a visible preference for considered responses over immediate ones. He told her it felt like a conversation, that every engine had a logic and the job was listening for where the logic had broken down. That most of the time when something failed, it wasn't random, it was the cumulative result of 100 small stresses that had gone unaddressed until one of them finally gave. Vivian was quiet for a moment after that. Then, "My father used to say that about companies." It was the first time she'd offered something about William Ashworth that wasn't in the context of the inheritance dispute, the first piece of him she'd handed over simply because it seemed to belong in the conversation. Callum received it without comment, and something in the space between them adjusted slightly, the way a room changes when a window is opened. By the time the session ended and the nurse came to close the line, Vivian's face had lost some of its careful arrangement. Not dramatically, she was not a person who lost her composure in large, visible pieces. But the compression around her eyes had eased, and she moved more slowly when she stood, and she accepted Callum's steadying hand at her elbow without the brief, resistant pause he'd anticipated. The paparazzi were waiting outside the building's east exit, 3 of them positioned with the patience of people who had done their research about which door she used. The photographs were published in the Seattle Times and 2 national entertainment outlets. Within 6 hours, Vivian Ashworth visibly weakened from treatment, supported by a tall man whose face the cameras caught in 3/4 profile. The captions were speculative. The speculation was exactly what she'd needed. She called him that evening after Nadia was in bed. Her voice was flatter than usual, the specific flatness of physical exhaustion rather than emotional distance. "It worked," she told him. 3 board members who had been non-committal reached out today. Having someone visible with me changes the narrative. Callum was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "Is that all that matters to you right now?" A pause that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. "Right now, yes." Another beat. "Does that bother you?" He considered the question honestly. "It bothers me that you're exhausted, and the first thing you did was check the news cycle." She didn't respond to that immediately. When she did, her voice had shifted slightly as if the flatness had cracked in one small place. "It's what I know how to do." He let that sit where it landed and didn't try to improve it. The following Wednesday, Vivian came to dinner. It hadn't been planned with any ceremony. Callum had mentioned that Nadia had been asking about her. Nadia had seen a photograph from the oncology center exit and had identified the woman immediately with the certainty of a child whose internal catalog of important things is both precise and uncluttered. He'd told Vivian this without strategy, just as information. She had said somewhat to his surprise that she would come by if the offer was genuine. The offer was genuine. She arrived at 6:15 in dark jeans and a simple gray sweater, no driver, no advance notice beyond a text sent 20 minutes earlier. Callum noticed the jeans. He noticed that without the structured scarf and the formal clothes, she looked more like a person who had been very tired for a very long time than like the CEO of a $4 billion media company, and that this version of her took up less space in a room in a way that was not diminishment, but revelation. Nadia was sitting at the kitchen counter when Vivian came through the door. She looked up from the gear assembly she was sorting. She had convinced Callum to bring home a box of salvaged components from the shop for her to categorize, and studied Vivian with the particular attention she applied to things that mattered. "Your smile is small, but it's there," Nadia announced. "I saw it." Vivian stopped in the kitchen doorway. Something passed through her expression. Surprise, Callum thought, and then something softer underneath it that she didn't fully name. "I've been told it needs work." "My dad can help," Nadia said. "He has the best one." Callum managed not to react to this by turning back to the stove with great focus. He made pasta with the sauce Joelle had taught him, the one that required more time than it appeared to, and produced something that tasted like an actual decision had been made rather than a default selected. The three of them ate at the kitchen table that was barely large enough for 2 adults and 1 6-year-old who required substantial lateral space for her elbows. Vivian ate with the focused appreciation of someone who had been surviving on things that arrived in containers, which Callum suspected was accurate. She didn't perform enjoyment, she simply ate, and the fact of her eating fully and without distraction was its own form of communication. After dinner, Callum read Nadia her chapter. This was the ritual that did not yield to external schedules, the fixed point around which everything else in their household rotated, and he had not made any adjustment to it tonight. He settled on the edge of Nadia's bedbook open and read about the girl with the salvaged rocket ship. Nadia listened with the focused absorption she brought to stories that took engineering seriously. From the hallway through the partially open door, he could hear the particular quality of stillness that meant someone was standing there and not moving. He didn't look up. He read to the end of the chapter, closed the book, kissed Nadia's forehead, and found Vivian leaning against the hallway wall when he came out, arms crossed loosely, her expression carrying something he didn't yet have a name for. "She called out to you," Vivian said quietly, "just before you finished. She said your name just to confirm you were still there. She does that. And you answered without looking up, just enough so she knew." He didn't know what to say to that. It was such a specific thing to have noticed. "My father used to do something similar," Vivian said. "When I was very small. I'd forgotten." She said it without apparent intention to continue, and he didn't push. They went back to this kitchen and he made coffee, and they sat across from each other at the small table in the particular quiet of a house where a child has recently fallen asleep, which is a different quiet from any other kind. The board meeting was 2 days later on a Friday morning in a conference room on the 38th floor of Ashworth Tower that had been designed to project an exact quantity of authority. The table was long and dark and surrounded by men who had been having some version of this conversation for the better part of a year. Callum sat beside Vivian and catalogued the room the way he catalogued an unfamiliar engine, identifying the components, understanding the relationships, noting which parts were under load and which were merely decorative. Franklin Doyle sat at the far end. He was smaller than Callum had expected from the briefing materials, not in height, but in the sense that the room's architecture had given him a scale that his actual physical presence didn't fully support. Silver-haired, well-tailored, with the careful stillness of a man who had learned early that controlled movement read as power. He looked at Callum, the way men look at things they consider beneath the level of genuine threat. A brief cataloging, a dismissal, a return of attention to Vivian. Vivian presented quarterly projections and a strategic overview of 3 pending acquisitions with the efficiency of someone who had not spent Monday in a chemotherapy recliner. She was precise and quick, and if the medication fog she'd described was present, it was not visible in this room at this moment. Callum watched the board members' faces and noted the ones who watched her with open assessment rather than political neutrality. Doyle let her finish before speaking. His voice was smooth in the way of a man who had been in rooms like this long enough that smoothness had become default. Ms. Ashworth's presentation is as always thorough. He paused with practiced timing. Before we move to vote on the Mercer acquisition, I'd like to raise the matter that several members have raised with me privately. The matter as he framed it was her capacity. He used that word specifically, capacity, which was a word designed to sound clinical rather than personal, though it was both. He referenced the treatment schedule, the visible fatigue at last month's shareholder call, 2 email exchanges where she'd asked her team to repeat information she'd been given the previous day. He cited these without apparent malice, which made them worse rather than better. Then he looked at Callum, and his expression shifted into something that was almost curious. I'd be remiss not to acknowledge the presence of Mr. Reese, who has been appearing in various contexts alongside Miss Ashworth over the past weeks. Perhaps he'd like to share something about his background so the board can understand the nature of his involvement here. The room went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when they're waiting for something to break. Callum leaned forward slightly. Not aggressively, he was not a man who needed aggression to occupy space. He met Doyle's gaze across the length of the table with the steadiness of someone who had been in rooms where people had already decided what his presence meant and had not been wrong yet about his ability to remain himself inside them. I'm here to support Vivian in whatever way she needs. A brief pause. Some people call that love. Others call it basic human decency. Either one works. The quiet in the room changed quality. Doyle's expression didn't move, but something behind his eyes recalculated. Vivian's hand found his under the table and pressed once briefly, and released. The meeting ended without a vote of no confidence, but Doyle's courtesies on the way out had the temperature of a man who was moving his resources rather than retreating. The following Tuesday, Callum was loading Nadia into the truck after school when the black sedan pulled into the drop-off zone and Franklin Doyle stepped out. He was not dressed for a school parking lot. He was dressed for an office, which meant he had come from somewhere else or was going somewhere else and had made a deliberate detour, and both of those things were statements. Nadia was already buckled in the back seat, headphones on, examining a drawing she'd made in art class. She did not see him. Doyle approached with the confidence of a man who had never needed to hurry. He stopped at a distance that was technically cordial and professionally invasive. "Mr. Reese, a word." Callum stood between Doyle and the truck. He didn't move toward him and didn't move away. The offer was $4 million. Walk away from Vivian Ashworth, tell the press the relationship had been a mutual decision to part ways, return to his shop and his life. In exchange, a number that was not quite real, that lived in the abstract space where very large sums of money live before they become concrete. Doyle delivered it with the practiced neutrality of a man who had made offers like this before and understood that the neutrality was part of what made them effective, the suggestion that this was simply a transaction rather than a threat. "Think about your daughter," Doyle said, "what that kind of security means for her future." Callum had been watching his daughter through the truck's rear window. She had looked up from her drawing and was watching him back through the glass, her headphones still on, her expression calm, with the calm of a child who trusts that whatever is happening outside the car is being handled correctly. The $4 million was a real number. He was not going to pretend it wasn't. It sat in his chest for one genuine moment, the image of Nadia's cardiology appointment and the Westbrook program and the bedroom leak and every other thing that money resolved, and he let himself feel the weight of it, because pretending it had no weight would have been dishonest, and Callum Reese was not dishonest with himself. Then, "The kind of father I want to be is one my daughter can be proud of." He got into the truck. Doyle called after him something about the offer having an expiration, something about reconsidering, but Callum was already starting the engine, and Nadia had pulled one side of her headphones off and was watching his face. "Who is that man, Daddy?" "Someone who thought he could buy something that isn't for sale." She considered this with the evaluative attention she applied to things she was still working out. Then she put her headphones back on and returned to her drawing, apparently satisfied that the situation had been resolved correctly. That night, Callum called Vivian and told her what had happened. Not on the phone, he drove to the Ashworth house after Opal came to sit with Nadia, and they sat in Vivian's study with the kind of directness that some conversations require to happen in person. Her fury was controlled but visible. She stood at the window for a moment after he finished, her back to him, and when she turned around, her face had the particular set of someone who is recalculating rather than reacting. "He approached you at Nadia's school." The flatness in her voice was not emotional distance. It was precision. She was being precise because imprecision would require her to feel more than she could currently afford. "He knows about the arrangement," Callum said. "The amount." He cited the number. "Then there's a leak." She sat down across from him. "Someone on my team or on the board has seen the contract." "Sloan?" Vivian shook her head immediately. "Not Sloan." She said it without uncertainty. 5 years. I'd stake everything." He believed her. "Then we have a problem that goes past Doyle." "We have several." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry he brought Nadia into it. He didn't get close to her." A pause. "But he knew to try." The conversation that followed was strategic, mapping what they knew against what they needed to know, identifying where the information could have originated. It lasted past 11, and somewhere in the middle of it Vivian got up and made tea with the slightly uncertain efficiency of someone who didn't do this often and was being careful not to reveal that, and she set a mug in front of Callum without asking how he took it, which was black, which was correct, and he noted that she had paid attention at some point without making it a production. The tea was good. He didn't mention this. He didn't need to. The Saturday of the 5th week fell on a night when the weather had gone cold and Callum was in Nadia's room at 11:14 finishing the 4th read-through of the rocket ship chapter because she'd been too wound up from her robotics club showcase to sleep when he heard the sound that every parent knows, the kind of breathing that is suddenly wrong, that has a different rhythm and a different quality, and activates something in the body before the mind has processed what it is. Nadia was sitting up in bed, her hand pressed to her chest, her face carrying a confusion that was worse than fear, because fear would have meant she understood what was happening. "Daddy?" Her voice was small and specific. "It feels funny." He was already moving. He had the phone in his hand and was dialing as he lifted her, speaking to the dispatcher with the forced calm of a man who understood that panic was information his daughter did not need from him right now. He got her into the truck. He drove the way he'd driven 3 years ago toward a hospital which was fast and deliberate and completely focused. Except this time it was Nadia's hand in his, at the red lights, rather than Joel's last unread message sitting in his pocket. At the emergency entrance he texted Vivian 4 words, "Nadia. Hospital. Now." He didn't think about whether she would come. He texted because she needed to know, and then he carried his daughter through the sliding doors and into the hands of people whose job was to make the funny feelings stop. The next 40 minutes were the kind that exist in a separate category from regular time. The pediatric cardiologist on call reviewed Nadia's history. Callum had her records on his phone because he had learned 3 years ago to keep the things that mattered somewhere he could access them. And the news was not catastrophic but was serious in a way that required the word monitoring and the phrase stress on the valve, and a conversation about what the coming months would need to look like. Nadia fell asleep during the monitoring period, her small hand loosening around Callum's, her face smoothing into the profound unconsciousness of a child whose body had finally decided to rest. He sat in the chair beside her bed and did not move. When he walked out to the waiting area he checked 1:47 a.m. Vivian was there. She was still in the clothes she'd been wearing when he texted. She had come directly. She was standing near the window with a paper cup of vending machine coffee that she was not drinking, and when she saw him cross the waiting room toward her, something in her face broke open in a way he had not seen from her before. Not relief exactly, but the precondition of relief. The moment before the body believes the crisis has passed enough to let it. "You came," he said. "Of course I came." Her voice was entirely unguarded. There was no performance in it and no strategy, just the words. He sat down in the nearest chair and put his face in his hands for about 30 seconds, not crying, just recalibrating, allowing himself the brief privacy of not being watched, while the adrenaline found somewhere to go. When he lifted his head, Vivian had sat down in the adjacent chair and was close enough that their elbows were nearly touching. She told him then about her father. She had not planned to tell him he could see that it came the way things come at 2 a.m. in hospital waiting rooms, which is without strategy, without the usual screening process that determines what is useful to share and what is better managed alone. Her father had died on a Tuesday afternoon in October while Vivian was in a board meeting that she had calculated she could not miss. He had died in a hospital room in this same building as it happened, though not this floor. She had not made it in time. She had arrived to find the room already past the need for her arrival, and she had stood in the doorway of a room that still contained her father, but no longer contained him, and she had understood in the most irreversible way that certain things cannot be rescheduled. "So you know what that feels like," Callum said. "I know exactly what that feels like." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the hard-won kind rather than the native kind. "And I know what it costs to carry it." He looked at her in the waiting room's institutional light, the same kind of light that had been in Mercy General the night of the wrong number, the kind designed for visibility rather than comfort. And he understood something that had been assembling itself over the past weeks without his full awareness. She was not simply a woman who had hired him for a strategic purpose. She was a person who had been managing an unbearable amount alone for a very long time, and had, through an accident of transposed digits, ended up beside someone who understood the specific weight of that kind of alone. The contract was still the contract. He was clear about that. But clarity and simplicity were no longer the same thing. The following Monday, Sloane Baxter called him and asked if they could meet without Vivian. He drove to a coffee shop in Capitol Hill that Sloane had selected, an unremarkable place with good sight lines to the door, and found her already seated with a sealed envelope on the table between her hands. The envelope had William Ashworth's name on it in the handwriting of a man who had known he was running out of time. Sloane explained what she'd been holding for 14 months, what the instruction on the inner envelope had said. Give this to the man who stands beside her when she can't stand alone, and why she'd waited until now to determine that Callum was that man rather than a complication. He opened the envelope beside Vivian that evening in her study. The contents were methodical and comprehensive in the way that a very intelligent man's final act of protection is methodical and comprehensive when he knows he won't be there to explain it. Bank correspondence. Email chains. A memorandum of understanding between Franklin Doyle and Apex Capital, a private equity firm whose acquisition history included several companies that had ceased to exist as independent entities within 3 years. A handwritten note in William's hand addressed to Vivian that ended with, "I needed you to find someone brave enough to help you prove it. I believe you will." Vivian read her father's note twice. Then she folded it precisely and held it in both hands and did not speak for a long moment. When she did, her voice was entirely steady in a way that cost her something visible. He knew. He spent the last months of his life collecting this. He trusted you to find the right person. She looked at the folded note. He trusted better than I did. The Wednesday of that same week, the door to Vivian's private oncology suite opened during treatment, and Garrett Hale walked in. He had the deliberate appearance of a man who had rehearsed his entrance, the right amount of hesitation, the right arrangement of regret, on a face that Callum recognized from photographs in the briefing file Sloane had provided. Tall, well-dressed, carrying the easy comfort of a person accustomed to being considered attractive and finding rooms receptive. He spoke to Vivian with the soft-voiced care of a man performing contrition for an audience. He had seen the coverage. He was sorry for the way things had ended. He understood now that he'd been a coward, and watching her fight this publicly had made him realize something about his own failures, and he was here because he cared genuinely, regardless of whatever else was happening in her life. Callum looked at him and felt nothing hostile, which was more useful than hostility would have been. He looked at him the way he looked at an engine with a symptom that didn't match the obvious diagnosis, with attention and without assumption, following the logic until it revealed where the actual failure was located. Garrett knew the specific time of this treatment session. That was not public information. He's working with Doyle. The words came out of Callum levelly without accusation, the way you state a mechanical fact. He knew your schedule. That's not something he found on his own. Vivian's jaw tightened by 1 degree. Garrett's performance faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough. Your way of handling things, Callum continued, his voice quiet. Put you alone in that hospital room at 2 in the morning. I'm not watching it put you there again. Garrett left. The nurse came in to check the line. Vivian was quiet for a long time afterward, watching the IV bag in the way she watched things when she was working through something she didn't want to say out loud yet. Finally, I don't know how to let someone help me. The admission came without decoration. It was simply true, delivered as such. Callum looked at her. The afternoon light through the suite's window was hitting the side of her face, and she looked tired in a way that went deeper than today, and she looked like someone who had just said something that cost more than it appeared to. I know, he said. I'm going to stay anyway. She didn't look at him when he said it, but something in her shoulders, which had been carrying the particular set of a person braced for the next impact, released a fraction of a degree. Outside, Seattle moved through its ordinary afternoon traffic and pedestrians and the indifferent mechanics of a city that did not know or care what was happening in this room. Inside, the monitors beeped. The IV line delivered its precise chemistry. And 2 people who had arrived at each other through a wrong number in the dark sat in the quiet together and let it mean what it was starting to mean. The Sunday before this board vote, Callum and Vivian worked through the evening at the study table with William Ashworth's documents arranged between them in the sequence Sloane's attorney had certified email chain's bank correspondence, the memorandum of understanding with Doyle's initials on every page. The work had a quality that Callum recognized from the best hours in the shop, when a complicated problem finally reveals its logic and the repair becomes a matter of execution rather than discovery. They knew what they had. Tomorrow was about delivering it to the right room at the right moment. Nadia appeared at 9:45 in her pajamas with 2 mugs of instant cocoa, moving with the careful deliberation of someone transporting something important. She set one in front of Callum and one in front of Vivian, and looked at the papers on the table with the calm assessment she applied to situations she had already processed internally. Are you fighting the bad guys tomorrow, Daddy? Callum took the mug. Yeah, baby. She shifted her attention to Vivian with the direct gaze that adults found either clarifying or mildly unsettling depending on their relationship to honesty. My dad always wins. I've been keeping track. Vivian looked at the child across the table and something moved through her expression. Not quite a smile, but the architecture underneath one, the place where smiles originate before they arrive on a face. That's good to know. Nadia nodded with the gravity of someone whose business was concluded and went back to bed. In the quiet that followed, Vivian set down the document she'd been holding and looked at Callum with the quality of attention that meant she had been working toward something for a while and had decided to stop deferring it. I don't want this to be an act anymore. She said it the way she committed to things directly, without the hedging that might have made it easier to retract. I haven't wanted it to be for some time. I didn't know how to say it without destabilizing something that was working. Callum set his mug down. The city outside the study window was doing its quiet Sunday things, indifferent and ambient. It stopped being an act the night you showed up at the hospital for Nadia. He said it once clearly, the way things that have been true for a while sound when they're finally spoken. I didn't want to say it first, but that's when. Vivian was still. Say that again. He met her eyes across the table, scattered with her father's evidence. It stopped being an act a long time ago, Vivian. I've just been waiting for the right moment to be honest about it. She exhaled, not dramatically, just fully, the way a person breathes when something they've been carrying has finally found a place to rest. She didn't reach for him, and he didn't reach for her. Tomorrow was the board vote, and there was still work to finish, and they were both people who understood that the most important things could wait 24 hours if they were genuinely important. They went back to the documents. But the room held a different quality after that, the way rooms do when something true has been said inside them. Monday arrived with a precision that felt almost staged, low autumn light, the city looking deceptively manageable from a distance. Callum dropped Nadia at school 45 minutes early. She hugged him at the door with more force than usual, which was her way of saying everything she didn't need language for, and then she went inside without looking back. He met Vivian in the lobby of Ashworth Tower at 8:30. She was in a deep charcoal suit, her posture carrying the quality of someone who has decided that whatever happens today will not diminish her. Something passed between them when he came through the doors that required no translation. The boardroom had already taken sides before anyone sat down. 22 directors at the long table, their expressions distributed across a spectrum from openly hostile to carefully neutral. Dorothy Wainwright sat at the far side with the stillness of someone who had attended enough of these proceedings to know the first 20 minutes rarely contained the actual information. Franklin Doyle sat at the head of the far end. He had the posture of a man who had already written the outcome and was attending the formality of its execution. Garrett Hale sat 3 chairs to Doyle's left, present at Doyle's arrangement. Callum had confirmed this through Sloan the previous week, along with the answer to the question of what Garrett received for his cooperation, a senior advisory role at Apex Capital, once the acquisition closed, a position worth considerably more than whatever he'd sacrificed by abandoning Vivian when her diagnosis arrived. The motivation was ordinary and complete. Callum had found it clarifying rather than surprising. Doyle presented his case with the thoroughness of someone who had been building it for months. Medical records, a video clip from a shareholder call where Vivian had asked her CFO to repeat a figure 3 email chains with delayed or unclear responses. He presented these without editorializing, which was the most effective approach, letting documents perform the diminishment while he maintained the posture of reluctant duty. Then Garrett was invited to speak. He entered the boardroom with the careful demeanor of a man coached on exactly how much regret to display in a setting that doesn't reward emotional excess. He spoke about Vivian's volatility in the months following her father's death, described episodes of confusion at home, moments when she had seemed uncertain about things she should have known. He described finding her in her home office late at night, speaking to her deceased father as though he were present. Every word was delivered with soft regret. It was the most sophisticated performance in the room. Doyle called the first vote. 11 in favor of the no-confidence motion, 11 opposed. A precise tie. Several faces registered surprise. Doyle had expected more. Dorothy Wainwright had not voted with him, and the composition of his 11 was not what he had calculated. He called for a second vote and announced a final piece of evidence. His assistant connected a laptop to the room's display system. The footage that appeared showed Vivian at her desk at 2:08 a.m., her movements slower than her daytime self, speaking to someone not visible, saying her father's name. Garrett had filmed this in her home at some point during their relationship had held. It had delivered it to Doyle on a schedule designed for maximum impact. The room's temperature changed. Several board members looked at the table. Vivian's jaw set by one precise degree. That was all. Callum stood up. He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He stood, and the movement drew attention the way deliberate physical action does in rooms where it's unexpected. Doyle's expression shifted fractionally. Mr. Reese has no standing in these proceedings. Vivian's voice came in level and immediate. He's my partner. I'd like to hear what he has to say. Callum connected his laptop to the display system and replaced the image of Vivian in her office with the first of William Ashworth's documents. He spoke without aggression in the voice he used when explaining a complicated repair to a customer, measured, specific, designed to be understood rather than to impress. Mr. Doyle has spent considerable effort documenting Ms. Ashworth's difficulties. What he hasn't shared is what he's been doing during the same period. The first document was an email chain between Doyle and a senior partner at Apex Capital dated 11 months earlier. The emails discussed Ashworth Media Group's acquisition value at a 31% discount to market contingent on a leadership transition. The second was the memorandum of understanding Doyle's initials on every page. The third was a bank statement showing a wire transfer of $5 million from an Apex Capital subsidiary to a Delaware holding company that Sloan's attorney had spent 2 weeks tracing to Doyle's direct control. The boardroom went very quiet. Sophisticated people do not erupt, they go still, which communicates more. Dorothy Wainwright spoke first. You accepted money from an outside acquirer while sitting on this board. Her voice had the quality of someone who has seen this specific variety of betrayal before and has never made peace with it. While voting on this company's future, while presenting yourself as a steward of it, Doyle began to respond. His voice, for the first time in Callum's observation, was operating without its characteristic smoothness. He said the word context. He said preliminary discussions. He said several other things that were technically sentences. Callum placed the final document on the screen. William Ashworth's handwritten letter, photographed and enlarged. He stepped back and looked at Dorothy Wainwright, and Dorothy understood what was being offered, the institutional weight her voice carried in this room that his did not yet have by tenure. She read it aloud without inflection, which made it more devastating than any dramatic delivery could have. William had written about Doyle's 30-year cultivation of board loyalties that belonged to him rather than to the company. He had written about recognizing too late what kind of ally he had actually maintained. The letter ended, "Franklin Doyle has been my enemy for 30 years. I just needed my daughter to find someone brave enough to help her prove it." The silence that followed lasted long enough to constitute its own verdict. The second vote was 20-2. Doyle's two were the men whose hands had gone up with pre-rehearsed readiness at the meeting's start, and their votes now looked exactly like what they were. Security arrived with quiet efficiency. Doyle walked out with the rigidity of a man whose posture had become his last available dignity. Garrett Hale was no longer in his chair. Dorothy Wainwright crossed to Callum as the room began to clear. She took his hand with the grip of someone who had learned long ago that a handshake communicates either everything or nothing, and she looked at him without any of the assessment the room had been performing all morning. "William would have approved of you," she said. "He had good instincts about people when he chose to use them." Then Vivian stood before the remaining board and said the thing no one in the room had anticipated. She was stepping down as CEO, effective immediately. She delivered this with the same precision she had brought to every quarterly report and every argument she had made in this room. She would remain as board chair with focus on long-term strategy and the oversight her father had intended when he left her controlling interest rather than operational control. She was nominating Sloan Baxter as the new CEO, effective upon board approval. 3 months of fighting cancer while running this company taught me one thing with more clarity than any presentation I've ever delivered. Life is more valuable than power. I want time for the future I'm building outside these walls. Her eyes moved to Callum, standing at the room's edge, and in them was the expression of a woman who has stopped managing the distance between what she feels and what she allows to show. Several board members registered the surprise of a choice that didn't follow expected logic. A woman who had fought this hard for her position, walking away from it voluntarily on the day she won. Callum understood it completely and without ambivalence. She was not retreating. She was choosing. The press conference that afternoon drew coverage from 17 outlets. Vivian stood before the cameras and explained with characteristic directness exactly how she and Callum had met the wrong number. The hospital room, the arrangement she had proposed, and what had happened to that arrangement over the following weeks. She did not apologize for how it had started. Then she looked at Callum where he stood to her left and did something that was not in any communication strategy. "Whatever the future holds for Ashworth Media, Callum Reese will be part of my personal future if he'll have me." The cameras swung toward him. He stepped forward and put his hands on either side of her face, and she looked up at him with the expression of someone who has allowed themselves to believe in something they wanted for long enough that the wanting had become a kind of weight now lifted. He kissed her in front of 17 cameras and did not think about any of them. The weeks that followed had a quality neither of them had experienced in some time, which was the quality of ordinary life being genuinely sufficient. Vivian reduced her schedule to what the foundation work required. The visible change in her was not dramatic. She was not someone whose transformations announced themselves, but it was consistent and cumulative. She slept more. She was present in rooms rather than processing the next obligation while appearing to inhabit the current one. She laughed at things that weren't designed to be funny. Callum returned to Reese Auto 3 days a week enough to keep his hands in work that had always been the most honest expression of who he was. His lead mechanic had managed well in his extended absence, which produced a specific satisfaction, the confirmation that he had built something that didn't require him to be its only functional part. Nadia's cardiology follow-up in November produced a report that Dr. Pulaski described as encouraging. The valve defect had not progressed. The stress episode had been managed appropriately, and the protocol established going forward was conservative and sufficient. Callum received this information with the contained gratitude of a man whose relationship with that specific fear had been long enough that its partial resolution felt almost too large to process in a fluorescent-lit office. He processed it in the parking lot, sitting in the truck for 4 minutes before turning the key. Vivian had come to the appointment. She sat in the waiting room with Nadia while Callum spoke with Dr. Pulaski, and when he came out, his daughter was asleep against Vivian's arm, her head tipped sideways, utterly unconscious in the way children sleep when they feel safe. Vivian was reading something on her phone with her free hand and had arranged herself to not disturb Nadia's position. She looked up when Callum appeared. "Good news," he said. Something in Vivian's face released in a way that told him she had been more anxious about this appointment than she had indicated. She looked down at Nadia sleeping against her and then back at Callum, and the expression she wore in that moment was one he would keep. 3 weeks after the appointment, Vivian took Nadia to the Seattle Art Museum on a Tuesday afternoon while Callum worked at the shop. They came home with a folder of sketches and a story about the Egyptian collection that Nadia delivered across dinner with the cumulative detail of someone who had been paying maximum attention to everything. Vivian contributed occasional details that Nadia had omitted and accepted Nadia's corrections when her version was imprecise, and the ease between them had the quality of something that had grown rather than been arranged. At the end of dinner, Nadia looked at Vivian with the focused consideration she applied to things she was working out in real time. "Can I call you something different?" she asked. "Ms. Vivian is what I call my teachers." Vivian set her fork down. The question had arrived without warning, and she received it without deflection. "What were you thinking?" Nadia considered this with genuine seriousness. "Not Mom. That's my mom's." A pause. "Maybe just Viv. That's what your friends call you." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "How do you know what my friends call me?" "Sloan," Nadia said with the matter-of-fact confidence of someone whose information sources were reliable. Something crossed Vivian's face that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, and was in fact something more specific than either the expression of a person receiving exactly the right thing in exactly the right form. "Viv works," she said. "I'd like that." Nadia nodded satisfied and returned to her pasta. Callum looked at his plate and said nothing, and felt the shape of what they were building settle into something more permanent than it had been that morning. The jewelry shop on Madison was run by a man named Orville Spence, who had occupied that building since 1987 and who approached custom work with the patience of someone who understood that specifications were not preferences. They were requirements, and shortcuts revealed themselves eventually in ways that couldn't be undone. Callum spent 40 minutes in a conversation that was in its way as precise as any diagnostic process. He described what he wanted. Orville asked questions. The ring that arrived 2 weeks later in a velvet box, white gold, a sapphire the specific blue of Nadia's eyes, a small gear worked into the inner surface of the band, where only someone looking for it would find it was exactly right in the way that things are exactly right when the person making them understood what was actually being asked. He gave it to Vivian on a Thursday evening in her kitchen, with no staging and no prepared speech. He told her what it was and what it meant, not a proposal, a promise, that when he did propose it would be because he loved her and wanted to build his life with her, not because of any arrangement or circumstance that had preceded the feeling. He told her that Nadia had been consulted on the sapphire and had communicated her requirements with considerable specificity. Vivian opened the box and looked at the ring for a long moment. When she looked up, her eyes were bright in a way she didn't attempt to manage. She approved the design. She said it had to have something from both worlds, something that was you and something that was us. Vivian put the ring on her right hand and held it in the kitchen light, the sapphire catching the warmth from the pendant lamp above the table. She was quiet in a way that was full rather than empty. Then, "When you're ready, it moves to the left." He was ready sooner than he'd told himself he would be, which did not surprise him when he examined it honestly. The readiness had been accumulating since November in the parking lot outside the cardiology office, since the dinner when Nadia had asked to call her Viv, since 100 ordinary moments that had each added their small weight to a certainty that no longer required time to become complete. He had not yet acted on the readiness when Christmas Eve arrived and Vivian stopped walking on the path through Eastlake Park. Nadia was home with Opal asleep after the earlier part of the evening and turned to face him with a small box in her hand. He looked at the box and then at her face. She was standing in the amber light of the park lamps with her breath visible in the cold and her expression carrying the quality of someone who has made a decision they are fully committed to and is about to speak it into permanence. "I know the conventional version of this belongs to you," she said. "I've been telling myself to wait. I've concluded that I'm not going to." A brief pause. "Patience has never been one of my functional strengths, and I've stopped pretending it might develop." She opened the box. Platinum band, clean and unornamented. He took it and turned it toward the light to read the inscription inside, "You'll know it's real when you stop keeping score." Joelle's phrase. The one he had told Vivian about during a late-night conversation in the third week of their arrangement, the sentence Joelle had said to him after an argument about something that no longer mattered, the sentence that had turned out to contain more truth than either of them recognized at the time. He had told Vivian this in passing, the way you tell people things at 2 in the morning when the usual filters are down. She had said nothing in response. She had been holding it for months and had it put in metal. His throat did something he allowed without apology. "Callum James Reese." Her voice did not waver. "Will you marry me? Not because of a contract, not because cancer and wrong numbers threw us into each other's path. Just because I love you and I want to spend every ordinary day showing up for you the way you showed up for me." The park was empty and cold, and the city was doing its Christmas Eve things beyond the tree line, entirely unaware of what was happening on this path. Callum thought of Joelle not with grief, not primarily, not anymore. He thought of her the way he had finally learned to think of her, which was with the gratitude that takes years to arrive, and is when it comes more honest than grief ever was. He thought about what she would say. He could still hear her clearly, which was one of the mercies. She would have said, "You showed up. That's the whole thing. That's all it ever was." Yes. Not with hesitation or the careful consideration of a man managing risk. Just yes, clean, and without reservation. 2 ceremonies. One small, just the people who were actually there for this. One big enough for everyone who deserves to celebrate it. She put the ring on his finger and he pulled her into his arms, and they stood in the cold together while the city went about its luminous, indifferent business beyond the trees. The small ceremony happened on a Saturday in February at a rented space outside the city. 12 people. Opal Gentry in the front row with the expression of someone whose faith in a specific outcome has been vindicated by events. Dorothy Wainwright, who had called Vivian the week after the board vote and said she intended to stay on the board for as long as Sloan needed the institutional knowledge which she estimated at 3 years. Sloan herself, who had accepted the CEO position with the calm of someone who had been doing the work for years and was now receiving the title. Dr. Harmon attending as a person rather than a physician. Nadia served as both flower girl and ring bearer, a dual role she had assigned herself, and defended against any modification with the quiet firmness of someone who understood that certain positions were non-negotiable. She wore a dress with small gears embroidered on the hem and performed both functions with the solemn focus of a professional. Callum's vows were simple. He told Vivian he would show up for every call she made wrong numbers and right ones. He would see her, not the title or the diagnosis or the survivor, just her. He was going to build something with her that honored where they'd both been and didn't need to erase any of it to move forward. Vivian's vows were longer. She promised to let him be strong when she was weak, and weak when he was strong without making either of those things a transaction. She promised not to solve his problems with resources, but to work beside him solving them. She promised to love Nadia as her own, while never asking her to replace what her mother had been. And she said that every day she would make the same choice, the deliberate choice she had first made on the morning she stopped pretending that a wrong number had delivered her a temporary arrangement rather than a permanent person. 2 years after a Tuesday night in February when a phone rang at 2:17 in the morning, the Craftsman House in northeast Seattle held the ordinary Saturday afternoon sounds of a family at rest. The Reese Ashworth Foundation had funded its first full year of operations. Reese Automotive Academy had graduated its initial cohort of 20 students, most of them from neighborhoods where stable employment was a statistical exception rather than a baseline expectation. And Callum had discovered in the teaching of mechanical work the same thing he had found in the doing of it, that the conversation between a person and a broken thing, when conducted with patience and attention, almost always revealed what needed to happen next. Vivian's cancer had been formally declared in complete remission 6 months earlier. Dr. Harmon had used the word cured with the careful precision of a clinician who understood what that word cost to say and what it meant to hear. Vivian had received it in the exam room without visible reaction and had cried in the car with a specificity of relief that Callum recognized as the release of something that had been held for so long it had become structural, a load-bearing fear whose removal required a moment of recalibration before the body understood it was allowed to be lighter now. On this particular Saturday afternoon, Nadia, 8 years old now, the gap tooth gone and replaced by permanent teeth she was still growing into, was giving 2 school friends a tour of the house with the proprietary satisfaction of someone displaying something they had participated in building. Callum stood in the hallway and listened. She had brought them to the study where a vintage rotary telephone sat on a shelf above the desk, an estate sale find that had become by some process of collective decision-making that no one had formally initiated the household's most significant object. "That's the phone that started everything," Nadia told her friends with the authority of someone narrating a story they were certain of. "Dad answered the wrong number and that's how we became a family." One of her friends asked what a wrong number was. Nadia explained it the way she explained mechanical things, with patience and the assumption that the concept was interesting enough to be worth understanding properly. She said that somebody called the wrong person by accident, that her dad got the call instead of the person who was supposed to get it, that her dad could have hung up but didn't, that he drove to the hospital in the middle of the night for someone he'd never met, because she sounded scared and being scared alone was something he understood. "And then what happened?" her friend asked. Nadia considered this with the slight pause of someone selecting the most accurate summary from several available options. "And then he just kept showing up," she said, "until it was real." Vivian appeared in the hallway beside Callum, her shoulder against his warm, and entirely herself, not the CEO, not the patient, not the woman who had called a wrong number in her darkest hour and found someone who came anyway. Just Vivian, his wife who had learned to let herself be known, and had turned out to be more than either of them had negotiated for. They stood together in the hallway and listened to their daughter explain the telephone to her friends, explaining the slow, satisfying arc of the dial returning to center, explaining how the old technology required you to commit to each digit before moving to the next. Outside, Seattle was doing its autumn thing, the particular amber light of October, when the leaves are still deciding and the air carries the quality of something about to change. Inside, the house held its ordinary Saturday self, and the vintage telephone sat on its shelf in the study, and the story it represented was exactly what Nadia had said it was. Her dad answered the wrong number. He kept showing up. Until it was real. That was the whole thing. That was all it had ever needed to be.